A flight attendant humiliated a black CEO mid-flight, but when he regained control, the entire cabin witnessed a shocking turn of events. A flight attendant cracked a fire canister against a black CEO's head. Thinking the blow would end the confrontation, he didn't realize the CEO would wake up seconds later with a strength no one on board could stop. The moment metal met skull, the entire cabin's fate changed. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always collapses when true power rises. The flight attendant's hand hovered too close to the fire canister clipped inside his apron, and that's when Dr. Rylan Merrin knew this wasn't a routine check. "Sir, I'll need you to hand over that canister," the man said, standing in the narrow aisle beside seat 1A with his shoulders squared and his voice low, flat, deliberate. His name tag read Curtis Vale, and though his face wore the faint smile expected of crew members, there was no warmth behind it. His gaze was fixed on the silver biometric case secured beneath Rylan's seat, the case that held the encrypted flight stability code for the HelionCraft project. To anyone else, it might look like a sleek carry-on, but for Rylan, it was the culmination of a decade's work and trust granted by the National Aerodynamics Board. Rylan looked up from fastening his seatbelt, eyebrows furrowing not in fear, but in calculated confusion. "It's encrypted flight data, not hazardous," he said evenly, his tone calm, professional. "And it's cleared with federal clearance level 5. He reached for his jacket pocket and produced a digital badge, its holographic sheen confirming his clearance level. "All documentation is on file with your airline security portal. You should have seen the clearance notice during crew prep." Curtis didn't blink. He didn't even glance at the badge. Instead, he took a half-step closer and spoke again, slower this time. "I said hand it over." His tone didn't rise, but it hardened, and the stillness behind it felt manufactured, almost rehearsed. Passengers in the nearby seats stirred slightly, their curiosity piqued by the tension. One man across the aisle lowered his newspaper just enough to watch over its edge. A younger man a few rows back paused his music and took out one earbud. But Curtis didn't seem to notice or care. His hand now floated an inch from the canister clip on his utility apron. Rylan's eyes tracked the movement, his mind racing, not in panic but in preparation. "No," Rylan said softly, and leaned forward just enough to slide the biometric capsule farther beneath the seat, locking it into its pressure seal bracket with a subtle metallic click. "I'm responsible for this capsule. Legally, technically, and ethically. If there's a security concern, I'd be happy to speak with the captain." Curtis's jaw tensed. He leaned in, lowering his voice so that only Rylan could hear. "That'll be a problem," he said, the edge of threat finally slipping into the open. His fingers tightened near the clasp of the fire canister. A serious one. There was no protocol in any airline manual for what was happening now. This wasn't about a misunderstanding of luggage. This wasn't about flight safety. This was something else entirely, and Rylan's instincts, honed through years of aerospace development, cybersecurity threats, and corporate espionage concerns, were firing in all directions. Still seated, Rylan studied the man. Curtis Vale wasn't posturing. He wasn't bluffing. He was executing something. A protocol, but not one from Crestloom's training handbook. The question now was whose? For a moment, time felt like it stretched thin around them, the subtle hum of the cabin turning into a low white noise behind the tension. The other passengers, though pretending to look away, were alert. Rylan could feel their gaze, even if they wouldn't meet his eyes. "I need you to return to crew prep," Rylan said with quiet precision. "There's no hazard here, and if you're unclear about the nature of this item, I could put you in touch with someone from the National Aerodynamics Board." Curtis didn't move. He exhaled once through his nose, a tight breath laced with irritation. His eyes lingered on Rylan's calm expression for a beat too long. Then, without another word, he stepped back, turned, and walked toward the front galley. Rylan's gaze remained fixed on the man's back until he vanished behind the first-class divider. Only then did he shift, reaching under the seat once more to double-check the seal. It was still secure, still locked to his fingerprint, but his hands were trembling. He leaned back in his seat slowly, mind working at full throttle. This wasn't a random security theater moment. Curtis hadn't asked for clearance ID or bothered to check the airline logs. He had one goal: separate Rylan from the canister. The implications made his throat tighten. The biometric capsule contained far more than data. It held simulation stability parameters that couldn't be reverse-engineered without triggering a multi-layer defense wipe. It was a technology slated for military-adjacent contracts, capable of revolutionizing zero-failure autonomous flight controls. If someone wanted it badly enough to intercept it mid-flight, that someone wasn't acting alone. Rylan's mind jumped to the obvious: internal sabotage, maybe even from someone within Crestloom's operations branch. The question wasn't just why, it was how high does this go? The intercom crackled suddenly, and a voice, the pilot, announced final clearance for takeoff. Flight 818 would be departing shortly from Marrow City. Cabin lights dimmed slightly, and seatbelt chimes echoed. As the aircraft rolled forward, Rylan pressed 2 fingers to the inside of his jacket cuff, tapping a biometric patch hidden beneath the fabric. The action triggered a silent ping to his holoslate and a pre-coded security alert to Vale Corps' off-site monitoring system. Asset condition compromised. Passive surveillance recommended. The message wouldn't trigger alarms, just eyes. Eyes in places that mattered. As the plane lifted off and the cabin lights steadied, Rylan closed his eyes for a moment, not to rest, but to listen. To every footstep in the aisle. To every tone change in the cabin speaker. To every rustle of movement that didn't match the rhythm of an ordinary flight. He had one job: deliver the capsule. But now that job had changed, because someone had already declared war before the wheels had even left the ground, and the flight hadn't even taken off yet. 30 minutes into the air, turbulence rolled softly through the cabin, causing drink cups to rattle faintly and overhead lights to flicker. Most passengers barely stirred, just a routine bump in the sky. In Seat 1 ADR, Rylan Merrin remained absorbed in his holoslate, fingers sliding across its interface with quiet precision. Diagrams and data models of the HelionCraft stabilizer algorithm pulsed on the translucent screen. He didn't notice the shift in shadows behind him. He didn't see the man approaching with a purpose stitched into his spine. Curtis Vale moved like a professional. Controlled, deliberate. His smile was absent now. No forced courtesy, no performative concern. Just silence, save for the low hum of the engines and the clicking of his polished black shoes. He leaned in over Rylan's shoulder, close enough to smell the sterile tang of blood about to be drawn. "I warned you," Curtis whispered, voice a blade hidden behind cloth. And then it happened. The emergency fire canister unlatched from Curtis's belt in a single motion. No hesitation, no warning. With the precision of someone who'd rehearsed this moment, he swung it sideways like a baton. The metal edge cracked against the side of Rylan's skull with a hollow, sickening thud. The sound echoed down the aisle like a dropped instrument in a cathedral. Blood erupted, splattering across the window beside 1A, a red arc against the pearlescent sheen of the aircraft interior. Gasps filled the cabin. A woman's voice shrieked. Somewhere behind the first-class curtain, the cockpit door creaked open in alarm, just for a second before someone behind it slammed it shut again. Rylan's body collapsed into the side panel with dead weight, slumping over the armrest. His hollow slate fell from his hands, blinking faintly before slipping under the seat. His legs were limp. One shoe nudged slightly from the jolt, but he didn't stir. Curtis didn't panic. With chilling composure, he reached down, slid the fire canister behind the lower rack of the service cart, and covered it with a towel from the supply bin. Then he turned smoothly, like nothing had happened, to address the nearest passenger, a middle-aged man reading a digital paper. "He fell," Curtis said coolly, gesturing toward the unconscious man. "Might have been low blood pressure. I'll get him oxygen." The passenger frowned, uncertain, but said nothing. Further down the aisle, a younger man sat quietly with a blanket over his lap and a black travel bag at his feet. His name was Vale. He was clean-shaven, dressed in simple charcoal slacks, and had the calm stillness of someone who noticed more than he let on. At the moment of the strike, Bram had looked up, blinking once. He hadn't gasped. He hadn't spoken. But the tiny green dot in his right contact lens lit up. Recording. He didn't blink again for several seconds as the camera in his eye traced Curtis's movements. He caught the canister swing. He caught the fake explanation. He caught the deflection. And he caught something else, Curtis's right foot, now planted directly on top of the metallic briefcase that Rylan had slid beneath his seat at the start of the flight. Bram leaned back slowly in his seat, reached for his armrest, and pressed his index finger into the inner lining of the fabric. A tactile interface glowed beneath his fingertip. A data upload initiated silently, beaming a live stream from his lens to a secure federal server. Curtis knelt beside Rylan now, reaching for an oxygen mask from the overhead compartment. His movements were clinical, but something about the act felt wrong, too slow, too intentional. A real attendant would have called for help, waved in backup, demanded space. Curtis did none of that. When another crew member, a younger man named Devin, stepped forward with a med kit, Curtis waved him off. "Oxygen only," Curtis said firmly. "He's stable. We don't want to cause more injury with unnecessary movement." Devin hesitated. "Shouldn't we?" I said oxygen only. His tone left no room for debate. Devin backed away. Curtis slipped the mask onto Rylan's face, then glanced down at the briefcase beneath his foot. He applied just enough pressure for the biometric sensors to fail a read attempt. Then, under his breath, he muttered something Bram barely caught through his lens mic. "That's one less threat to the plan." Bram's jaw tightened. His fingers tapped once more, marking the timestamp of the statement. The plane continued forward like nothing had happened. Most passengers settled back into uneasy silence, trusting the illusion of order. The curtain to first class had been closed again. No official announcement was made. Rylan's head lolled slightly to the side as oxygen hissed quietly into his nostrils. Blood was still trickling from his temple. His body didn't move. Curtis stepped back, standing upright beside the cart, eyes scanning the cabin with professional detachment. Everything seemed under control, but someone else was recording, someone he didn't expect. Rylan's consciousness snapped into jagged fragments as a rush of oxygen hissed through the mask strapped to his face. Pain radiated from his temple, sharp, rhythmic, like a hammer tapping against bone. He didn't move at first. Couldn't. His head lolled slightly, the cabin lights spinning in soft halos through the blood smudged across his vision. Something was wrong. Not just physically, though that much was clear from the warm, sticky trail behind his ear, but structurally. The silence in the cabin was wrong. Eerie. Too controlled. He blinked, forcing his gaze to stabilize. The flight attendant beside him wasn't Curtis. This one was younger, dark-haired, visibly nervous as he adjusted the oxygen tube. His name tag read Tanner, but his hands were shaking, his eyes darting to the front galley every few seconds like a man unsure of which rule to follow. Rylan's training in high-risk engineering environments kicked in, observe first, move later. Then, a shadow moved just beyond the curtain. Curtis. Rylan's pupils narrowed as his focus honed in. Curtis wasn't tending to passengers or making an announcement. He was crouched by the galley wall, his body obscuring something behind the service card. Rylan's blurred vision caught the glint of brushed steel in Curtis's hand, a flash of something small, cylindrical. The canister. It was unmistakable. The biometric casing security grooves, the faint glow of the anti-tamper light on its side, visible only to someone who knew what to look for. Rylan's heart stuttered, not from fear, but fury. The capsule was his company's apex invention, a culmination of years of algorithmic development and national compliance layers. It wasn't just a vault of data, it was a federal contract in motion. Whoever wanted it gone wasn't petty. They were prepared. Curtis leaned forward and pressed something on the wall. A panel that Rylan had never seen used on a standard commercial aircraft hissed slightly and opened, no louder than a whisper. A hidden compartment. Not standard, not legal, and definitely not a coincidence. Rylan's mind cleared in a painful burst. This wasn't about a personal vendetta. This was sabotage. His hand jerked slightly, testing motor response. A dull ache screamed up his shoulder, but he could move. He curled his fingers into the seat edge, gripping with slow determination. The oxygen flow wasn't helping much, but his training in zero-pressure cabins came back to him. Breathe slow. Don't panic. Think faster than the pain. Across the aisle, Vale leaned against the window, his eyes deceptively idle. But beneath the reflective sheen of his irises, his contact lens flickered, recording. He never looked directly at Rylan or Curtis, but his thumb moved in a subtle motion beneath his folded arm. Uploading. Mid-flight. Federal server. Untraceable. In the rear of the cabin, a man wearing jeans and a travel vest reached beneath the seat in front of him. The movement was casual, but the grip he applied to the metal bar was firm. His name was Agent Joran Kell, Flight Certified Security Officer, currently traveling under non-duty status. He hadn't made a move yet, but his eyes had been locked on Curtis ever since the announcement delay 5 minutes prior. The intercom buzzed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're initiating a quick mid-air systems calibration delay. Nothing to worry about. Please remain seated." Rylan's fingers twitched. There was no such thing as a mid-air calibration delay without triggering a cabin-wide compliance alarm. But no one seemed alarmed. That meant the system had been overridden. Curtis was buying time. Rylan's body, though battered, responded with instinctual urgency. He reached, slowly, shakily, under his seat where the biometric capsule had been secured. His fingers scraped empty carpet. Nothing. It was gone, fully extracted. His heartbeat surged with clarity. He looked down the aisle. The crew was frozen in motion, either complicit or too afraid to act. Bram didn't move, but the slightest tilt of his head confirmed what Rylan feared. He was on his own for now. Pain coiled through his rib cage as he tried to sit straighter, every breath reminding him of the trauma to his skull. The oxygen hiss wasn't enough to dull the edges, but his mind had already surged past the pain threshold. His body may have been on the verge of collapse, but his will was awake. Curtis turned and walked down the aisle casually, his posture relaxed, as if nothing had happened. He paused to speak briefly with another crew member, words too soft to hear. But his body language betrayed a hidden confidence, as though a checkpoint had been passed. Rylan leaned his head back and breathed deeply. He couldn't move yet, couldn't act, but he could plan. He remembered the emergency override tucked inside his wristwatch, an engineering relic embedded with an uplink that could trigger a distress ping if paired with the right biometric signal. But the pairing required clear vitals, and his weren't stable yet. The only way to send the alert would be to stabilize or to simulate a critical spike. Another risk. His vision wavered again. But the image of Curtis sliding the capsule into that hidden hatch returned, crisp and damning. Whoever was behind this didn't want it gone. They wanted it delayed, cloaked, and perhaps rerouted after the flight. No death, just discreditation. Just enough to dismantle the K-9 Sentinel launch. Rylan clenched his jaw, forcing focus. The idea of giving in to unconsciousness, to confusion, made his stomach turn. His body might be failing, but his principles weren't. And this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every executive, every innovator, every minority face that tried to push forward in a system designed to punish quiet excellence. "They think I'm down," he muttered hoarsely, barely audible over the soft click of cabin air vents. His hand curled into a fist. "That's their mistake. I wasn't supposed to wake up." The fire canister had barely left Curtis's hand when Rylan's eyes snapped fully open, the world tilting in a dizzy blur of lights, motion, and raw instinct. His head throbbed with a deep, pulsing ache, but his reflexes, trained by years of handling pressure, machinery, and emergency simulations, ignited faster than thought. He caught the faint metallic beep coming from the crew panel above Curtis's wrist. A sharp red alert flashed across its screen. Unauthorized canister log detected. "Alert, Captain." Curtis froze for half a heartbeat, his jaw tightening as he stared at the warning, realizing his timeline had just shortened. The aisle around them hummed with confusion, passengers shifting, whispering, trying to understand what they had heard. Rylan stayed low on the narrow floor, every movement deliberate. He felt the warm slide of blood slipping down his cheek, soaking deeper into his collar. But he kept crawling, inch by inch, toward the galley where the dim blue lights flickered. His fingertips brushed the cold metal of the seat rails as he moved, steadying himself so the passengers wouldn't notice how badly his body trembled. He knew he didn't have long. Curtis was unpredictable, and the alert had cornered him. Vale, seated a few rows back, watched everything unfold through narrowed eyes. His fingers moved quickly over his concealed wrist pad, sending a covert message directly to the cockpit. Passenger assaulted. Security breach. Forward section. He kept his expression calm, almost bored, as though he was checking a routine flight update. But his heart raced. He could already see the chain reaction forming, like gears turning in a quiet machine. Agent Joran Kell had already read the message. His posture shifted subtly as he rose halfway from his seat, blending into the moment as if simply stretching his legs. His gaze locked on Rylan, bloody, unsteady, but alive. Joran began to move slowly down the aisle toward the first-class divider, slipping seamlessly between passengers who were too distracted to notice the controlled tension of his stride. But Curtis noticed. His head whipped around sharply, eyes catching the faint movement in the bulkhead reflection. He knew he was losing control of the situation. His hand darted toward his apron pocket again, toward the fire canister, still smudged with traces of Rylan's blood. The clang of metal against metal echoed as he attempted to retrieve it. He turned, expecting Rylan to still be slumped or crawling in confusion. Instead, Rylan was already rising. With a guttural groan, he pushed himself upright, his body screaming in protest as he lunged forward. His forearm shot upward, fueled by raw survival, slamming against Curtis's wrist with a crack that echoed across the cabin. The canister slipped from Curtis's fingers and spun across the floor, striking the galley wall with a metallic bang that made several passengers gasp. Curtis hissed through clenched teeth and stumbled back, one hand clutching his wrist as pain flashed across his face. Rylan stood there, bleeding, swaying, but burning with a fierce clarity that cut through the haze. For a breathless moment, the cabin froze. Every pair of eyes locked onto the two men. Curtis's breathing sharpened. He tried to advance again, but Rylan stepped forward, matching him. His vision blurred at the edges, but his focus never wavered. He saw the fear in Curtis's eyes, not fear of Rylan, but fear of failure. That told Rylan everything. Someone else was pulling the strings. Someone who had expected Curtis to succeed. Curtis reached out as if to push Rylan back, but Rylan intercepted his movement with surprising steadiness. His voice, though hoarse, carried clearly through the stunned silence around them. "You stole my seat. You stole my data. You tried to steal my life." Curtis's jaw twitched, but he didn't respond. Passengers stared, unable to tell whether they were witnessing a confrontation or the beginning of something far larger. Rylan took one slow, deliberate step forward. His expression hardened, not with rage, but with resolve sharpened by the knowledge that this attack was bigger than the two of them. He wiped a streak of blood from his brow with the back of his hand, his chest rising and falling in slow, measured breaths. Then his voice dropped to a cold whisper that cut through the charged silence. "Now watch me take it back." Rylan moved, not with speed, but with purpose, the kind of deliberate control born from years of building systems where every microsecond mattered. His fingers slid off the armrest. His knees trembled beneath him. The wound on his temple still pulsed, warm blood trailing down the side of his face. But none of it stopped him. Gripping the back of a seat, he rose 1 inch at a time, gaze locked forward like a missile tracking a target. Curtis Vale stood at the galley threshold, frozen for a breath, just a breath before he lunged. Curtis grabbed Rylan by the lapel, yanking him close with one hand. "You're making this worse," he spat, his breath hot and sour. His fingers curled tighter, pressing into the fabric of Rylan's blazer like claws. Around them, passengers gasped, half rising from seats, some fumbling with phones, others frozen in disbelief. But Rylan didn't pull away. Instead, his hands that had once fine-tuned aerospace turbines and calibrated gyroscopic sensors under the pressure of high-altitude conditions, moved with a terrifying calm. With both arms, he drove upward, clamping down on Curtis's neck in a seamless motion that caught the flight attendant off guard. The strength came not from rage, but from focus, the kind engineers reserve for solving problems no one else understands. The back of Curtis's head slammed against the metallic galley wall with a hollow clang. The entire first-class cabin gasped. One man ducked. Another dropped his drink. Somewhere behind them, a woman screamed, but her voice was quickly swallowed by the roar of tension stretching to its breaking point. Rylan said nothing at first. His jaw clenched. His shoulders shook, not from weakness, but restraint. Curtis thrashed, reaching up to claw at Rylan's wrists, but the CEO's grip held firm. He pressed Curtis into the wall, not with brute strength alone, but with the knowledge of pressure points, leverage, and fear. Curtis's eyes widened. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Only then did Rylan lean in, his voice ablade through the noise. "I build systems that don't fail," he whispered, his breath steady despite the chaos. "You picked the wrong one." The moment held. For 1 second longer than anyone expected, they remained locked there, Rylan's blood dripping onto Curtis's uniform. The silence around them, so complete it felt like the entire plane had stopped moving. Then motion. A heavy boot struck the aisle. Agent Jorenkel, already closing in, surged forward and grabbed Curtis from behind. In a practiced move, he locked Curtis's arms and twisted him away from Rylan, yanking him into a clean restraint. The clink of metal cuffs echoed through the cabin. Rylan let go the moment Joren took over. His hands dropped to his sides, shaking slightly. Blood traced the line of his jaw. Passengers peered around their seats, a sea of shocked, blinking faces trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. The co-pilot appeared at the galley divider, his face pale as he scanned the scene. Blood on the floor, an unconscious man restrained, passengers filming openly. He muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. This flight just made the news. From the opposite end of the aisle, Vale stepped forward, his calm deliberate. He reached into his coat pocket, lifted a federal badge, and let it hang in the air like a verdict. "It already did," Bram said, "and you're all in it now." The cabin jolted as the pilot initiated the sudden turn. A sharp bank of the aircraft signaled the diversion, and the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, flat and rehearsed. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to a medical incident and a personnel matter, we are diverting to Northbridge Aerodrome. Please remain seated and follow all crew instructions." The announcement barely veiled the gravity of what had occurred. No one spoke. The tension was carved into the silence like grooves in metal. Dr. Rylan Merrin sat stiffly in one, a gauze wrap hastily applied to the side of his head, held in place by a strip of medical tape. The bleeding had slowed, but not the pain. Each throb behind his right, I reminded him of the fire canister's brutal arc blood, still stained his fingers where the first aid wipe hadn't reached. His breath came slow but deliberate. He was alive, but the danger hadn't passed. It had just changed form. Curtis Vale, still dressed in his flight attendant uniform, sat restrained 3 rows ahead, his wrists bound with nylon flex cuffs. Agent Jorenkel, now fully alert and visibly tense, stood beside him. Curtis didn't resist. He didn't speak. He simply stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable. But there was something in the curve of his mouth, something that wasn't fear. It was satisfaction. Rylan leaned slightly forward and whispered to Vale, who now occupied the adjacent seat. "He's calm. Too calm." Bram's eyes narrowed. "I know. He's waiting for something." Suddenly, Rylan's hollow slate chimed, a sound faint but sharp against the stillness. He tapped the screen and saw the alert flash in urgent red. "Data breach detected. Clone attempt blocked. Elevate clearance." His jaw tightened. Someone had tried to force the K-9 Sentinel capsule open. The kinetic shielding had stopped them, for now, but the breach attempt confirmed what he already suspected. "This was never about me," Rylan murmured. "It was always about the system. About K-9. Curtis, perhaps hearing the murmur, slowly turned his head, locking eyes with Rylan for a brief second. The look wasn't one of hatred. It was strategic, calculated. Then he smirked, just slightly, and looked away. Outside the window, the gray stretch of the Northbridge landing strip came into view. Emergency vehicles lined the tarmac, their lights pulsing rhythmically but with no sirens. Several figures in high-visibility jackets stood at the ready, but not all of them looked like responders. One, in particular, stood still apart from the group. A man in a slate-gray overcoat, arms crossed, no ID badge visible, and eyes fixed directly on the aircraft's forward cabin. Rylan noticed him immediately. "Do you see him?" he asked, barely turning his head. "Yeah," Bram replied, already reaching into his blazer for his backup comm. "And he's not airport security." Behind them, a passenger sneezed loudly, startling half the row. The tension didn't break. It fractured into smaller pieces, splintering through every whisper and glance. The aircraft began its final descent. The seatbelt lights flicked on. The co-pilot's voice offered procedural calm over the speaker, but no one relaxed. Curtis exhaled through his nose, almost chuckling. "You still don't get it," he said low, just enough for Joran and Rylan to hear. "You're playing checkers." Joran leaned down. "Then you should pray the board hasn't flipped." Curtis shrugged, unconcerned. "I already won my part. Now it's out of my hands." Rylan ignored the verbal bait. He tapped quickly on his hollow slate, entering a biometric code. A new screen lit up. Kinetic vault integrity. 86%. Tamper stress detected. Reauthentication required at level 7. The implications were clear. Whoever was waiting at Northbridge wasn't just hoping to intercept the capsule. They were counting on getting it now, before federal custody made access impossible. The landing gear deployed with a mechanical shutter beneath them. Passengers braced instinctively as the aircraft hit the tarmac with a hard, bouncing impact. The brakes roared. A few overhead bins popped slightly, and a metallic rattle ran down the length of the fuselage. They were down, but far from safe. Outside, the emergency team moved forward. The engines hissed as they powered down. The man in the gray coat hadn't moved. If anything, he was now flanked by two others, similarly dressed, similarly unmarked. Joran's hand hovered over his concealed weapon as he made a call on a secure line. Bram followed suit, activating a discreet channel to his federal contact. "Ground units in position?" Bram asked quietly. "Confirmed," came the voice on the other end. "But be advised, we're picking up chatter." Someone else was dispatched, unaffiliated with the airport manifest. Rylan looked down at the capsule, now secured in a biometric vault case, clutched under Bram's arm. If they try to force it open again, they'll trigger the reactive fail-lock. And then, Bram asked, then the algorithm wipes itself, and everything we've built goes with it. Curtis smiled again, silent, patient, rehearsed. Not the grin of a man defeated. The grin of a man who believed he'd merely played his role in a longer, darker sequence. The kind of grin that meant someone else would soon step in. Rylan turned back toward the window as the aircraft door hissed open and the first responder stepped on board. The light outside looked sterile, tense. It didn't feel like rescue. "They think it ends when we land," Rylan whispered again, barely audible above the sound of the pressure equalizing in the cabin. "It actually starts there." The landing hit hard, wheels screaming, brakes locking, bodies jolting against belts. Emergency vehicles rolled toward the aircraft as it taxied to a stop at Northbridge Aerodrome. But something was wrong. Rylan Merrin felt it instantly, not in the rumble of the tires or the hiss of hydraulics, but in the way too many responders moved too precisely. Their uniforms were clean, but their eyes too rehearsed. These weren't just medics and ground staff. He stood slowly, ribs protesting, flanked by Bram Vale and Agent Joran Kell as they exited through the front stairwell. The air outside was crisp, the tarmac lit in stark floodlight. Rylan immediately spotted him, a man standing just beyond the hangar's shadow, wrapped in a gray overcoat, hands in pockets, no badge, no credentials, no hesitation in the way his eyes drilled into the briefcase in Bram's hand. "Who's that?" Rylan asked, his voice low but sharp. "Unknown," Bram muttered, shifting the briefcase ever so slightly closer to his chest. "But he's not press." They stepped further down the stairs, and Curtis Vale, still cuffed and flanked by two security officers behind them, let out a low chuckle that didn't match his bruised face. "Told you," he said, grinning despite the blood on his collar. "You're playing checkers." Before Rylan could react, two responders peeled off from the group near the ambulance, moving with military speed, cutting a diagonal path toward Bram. Their steps weren't panicked. They weren't helping. They were flanking. "Down!" Joran barked, yanking Rylan to one side as Bram pivoted on instinct. In that split second, the two incoming men found themselves intercepted. Ground agents in plain tactical were tackled them mid-step. A blur of motion, knees hit concrete. One man's radio skittered across the ground. The wind whipped past as more agents poured out from a nearby stair truck, clearly prepositioned under Joran's quiet orders mid-flight. Curtis's smirk flickered, then vanished. The briefcase, the encrypted canister containing the K-9 Sentinel algorithm, was now at the center of a tightening security ring. Bram looked to Joran, his breathing fast but controlled. "Here," he said, passing the case into Joran's gloved hands. The agent took it solemnly and walked briskly toward the armored containment vehicle, now reversing up the ramp. "Federal custody now," he said firmly, placing the case into a secure vault box before sealing it with a biometric code only he and one other agent knew. Rylan, still gripping his side, where the bruising radiated like fire beneath his shirt, nodded once. His vision was still a little hazy, but not his clarity. "Good," he said hoarsely, "because they'll come again. And next time, it won't be in uniform. I want to top-hold off this thing." Rylan's feet hit the sterile floor of the field hospital with more resistance than he expected. The room was whitewashed and humming with overhead fluorescence, too clean, too quiet. The type of silence that didn't calm but warned. A medic guided him to an observation bed with curt, professional hands, and a scanner was lowered over his skull. The screen lit up in hues of blue and red, identifying a minor concussion, deep bruising across the left temple, and microabrasions down his neck from when he hit the seat rail. No fractures, but enough damage to remind him he had nearly been erased. He blinked slowly, grounding himself. His head throbbed in pulses. The rhythmic beep of a nearby heart monitor synced with his growing clarity. Everything inside him still ached from impact, but his thoughts were no longer fractured. What happened on that plane hadn't been an isolated act of violence. It was calculated, tactical, practiced. Bram Vale stood across the room, already hunched over a data terminal. His fingers worked fast, pulling encrypted feeds from the secure flight logs. His contact lens recorder had captured everything: the strike, the deception, Curtis's movement toward the hatch, even the tension that had passed through the cabin like static before the diversion call. But Bram wasn't stopping there. He'd already retrieved secondary comm logs from the cockpit panel, signals meant only for internal routing, but flagged due to unauthorized reroutes mid-flight. "Look at this," Bram said without turning. He locked the forward hatch for 7 minutes. Long enough to play something, or remove something. Rylan sat up straighter, wincing as his shoulder tugged against the bandage. He was bent over the panel. Not standard procedure. He slid the canister into a compartment that shouldn't even exist. Bram nodded grimly. "It's not in the specs. Already checked." The door opened with a sharp hiss. Agent Joran Kell entered, dressed in dark fatigues now, the casual disguise from the flight discarded. He held a stack of printed photos, security freeze frames from earlier that day. He dropped them on a table with controlled urgency. One showed Curtis speaking with a man in a gray overcoat before the flight, outside the crew entry gate. Another showed that same man passing a small, hard-shelled object to Curtis under the shadow of the aircraft. Curtis wasn't improvising, Joran said. He was executing. Rylan exhaled through his nose. "Who is he?" "No ID yet," Joran replied. "No airline record, no badge scans, and facial recognition turned up only partial matches. But he's not alone. Whoever's behind this has reach, and they didn't expect you to get back up." Bram pulled up another screen, this time a cascade of metadata from the capsule itself. "This'll prove it." The kinetic shielding system recorded a tamper attempt. Time-stamped 20 minutes after takeoff. He turned the display toward them. Curtis tried to force it open. Rylan's eyes narrowed. And failed, Bram replied. The shielding locked down. No data breach. But the system tagged it as a Category 3 event. That's the kind that gets filed automatically on both our end and with the National Aerodynamics Board. Rylan leaned forward. Good. That means someone else already knows. Joran was less optimistic. Or it gets buried. Depends on who gets to the logs first. Bram's face darkened as he pulled up another file. This one a personnel dossier on Curtis Vale. It was incomplete, redacted in sections. But one word leapt off the screen like a scar across clean skin. Section Echelon. Rylan whispered it, tasting the weight of it. Internal. Bram nodded. Crestloom's internal risk operations. Supposed to handle asset recovery, passenger escalation, that kind of thing. But this wasn't recovery. This was a disruption. A planned one. Rylan stared at the screen, jaw tightening. Disrupt without killing. Hurt, confuse, stall. Because if I died, they'd be facing audits. Lawsuits. A federal review. Exactly, Bram said. They didn't want to eliminate you. They wanted to discredit you. Delay you. Just long enough to replace your seat at the table. The room went still for a beat. They tried to erase you, Bram continued, voice low. But not fully. Just enough. Rylan closed his eyes for a second, then reopened them, sharper. That's the new model. Quiet sabotage. Public confusion. Just enough doubt to ruin a man's reputation, but not trigger oversight. Outside, the wind rattled softly against the window frame. The hospital wasn't truly isolated. Nothing federal ever was. Rylan's hollow slate sat nearby, blinking. He reached for it slowly and entered his passcode. The screen lit up with a red notification. Data breach attempt blocked. Clone attempt failed. Elevate clearance. His grip on the slate tightened. They weren't after me, he said aloud. They were after K9 Sentinel. They wanted the code, the algorithm, everything. Bram's fingers froze on the terminal keys. Joran stepped forward. Then they're not done, the agent said quietly. If this was a trial run, they'll come again. And next time, they won't make the mistake of sending someone so visible. Rylan stood slowly, the movement painful but deliberate. He paced to the edge of the room and looked out at the tarmac. Somewhere beneath the polished steel and false lights, the threat remained. Silent, patient. He turned to Bram. Prepare the packet. Flight footage. Internal comms. Dossier en section échelon. And log the tamper event from the capsule. I want it submitted directly to the federal tribunal. You sure? Bram asked. Rylan nodded. They tried to turn my data into leverage. They thought we'd panic. They thought I'd hide it. He stared straight ahead, voice steady. Tell the board the launch is off until this is public. Joran blinked. You're delaying, Sentinel? I'm not delaying anything, Rylan replied. I'm stopping the cycle. He walked back to the terminal, blood still caked beneath his collar, vision pulsing with the weight of what nearly happened. He opened a secure comm line, dialed the Soren Dynamics board, and left a single message. If we don't expose it now, it'll happen again to someone who won't wake up. The attendant smirked, convinced the impact had given him control, unaware that the CEO's eyes would open with a calm, focused fury. Every passenger watched as the man who was supposed to stay down slowly stood up, turning the entire aircraft silent. If you believe cruelty under a uniform always folds when discipline meets resolve, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The courtroom fell silent as the bailiff called the session to order. No opening ceremony, no wasted words, just the heavy sound of leather shoes striking polished tile as Dr. Rylan Merrin entered the chamber. His pace was measured, not hesitant. The dark suit he wore was pristine, but beneath the tailored elegance, a gauze wrap peeked beneath his hairline. A fresh scar stretched just past his temple. It hadn't healed. Neither had the betrayal. Across the room, in the defendant's box, Curtis Vale sat with the poise of someone coached not to flinch. His face was composed, lips flat, but his eyes moved, tracking every whisper in the gallery. He didn't look at Rylan. Not once. Two men flanked him, lawyers in steel gray suits, their tablets filled with spin, justifications, and pleas for leniency. They wouldn't help him today. The judge, a tall, silver-bearded man named Ronald Kays, reviewed the tribunal's purpose with no embellishment. This session concerns the physical assault aboard Crestloom Flight 818, the attempted theft of encrypted federal cargo, and the emerging link between airline personnel and systemic interference with executive-level data transfers. Then he looked up. Mr. Vale, your employer, and the system they represent are on trial today. Behind Curtis sat the gallery, rows of dark suits, press tags, and worried Crestloom executives who, just a week ago, had hoped this scandal would blow over. Now, they were trapped beneath the hot breath of accountability. Bram Vale stood, crisp in a midnight blue blazer, federal insignia displayed plainly on his lapel. He walked to the center with quiet purpose and tapped his wrist console. A large display came to life behind him. This is time-stamped footage from Seat 1A, recorded mid-flight by Federal Contact Lens Protocol. Bram began. The subject is Dr. Rylan Merrin. The assailant, your employee. The footage unrolled without commentary. The moment Curtis swung the fire canister, a sharp intake of breath swept the courtroom. Someone in the gallery muttered, "That's murder." But Bram didn't pause. He advanced to the next file, capsule tamper logs, showing forced access attempts, power surges, and biometric override failures, all while the capsule remained locked under Curtis's foot. Then came the seismic blow. Bram turned to the panel of tribunal advisors and tapped again. "This," he said, "is a redacted internal memo from Crestloom's operations branch. It outlines targeted disruption efforts against executives transporting federally aligned technologies." The screen displayed a bold heading, Section Echelon, Strategic Non-Lethal Interventions. Gasps, not just from observers, but from the legal team behind Curtis. One of the attorneys leaned forward, whispering urgently. Judge Kays raised a brow. "Source. Leaked anonymously," Bram replied. "Timestamped 3 days ago. Metadata confirms access from Crestloom HQ. And it doesn't stop there." He turned toward a side door. "Your Honor, we call Agent Joran Kell." Joran entered, posture straight, face cold. As he took the stand, the federal insignia on his coat drew immediate attention. His voice was calm. Curtis Vale was not operating alone. Section Echelon assigned him as an internal resolver to ensure delays in high-value tech deliveries. "We've confirmed a second operation was scheduled for next month, targeting a CEO from Stratasine Aerotech. Same pattern, same justification. Mitigate minority-led tech firms gaining strategic advantage in federal contracts." The words landed like metal on glass. In the gallery, one of the Crestloom executives slumped forward, head in hands. Curtis shifted for the first time. His lips twitched, not quite a smile, not quite fear. Judge Kays looked at Rylan. "Dr. Merrin, would you like to address the court before we recess for judgment?" Rylan rose slowly, each movement deliberate. He stepped to the center, meeting no one's gaze except Curtis's. "I'm not just a CEO," Rylan said. His voice was low, but it carried. "I'm a systems builder. I design frameworks that fly aircraft through hurricanes. I write code that can land a shuttle with one engine out. And I built K-9 Sentinel to protect lives, not for it to be weaponized by people who fear innovation from men who look like me." He paused. "I survived a strike that should have ended my career. But some don't. Some never even get the seat in 1A. Because of men like this. Because of policies like those. This wasn't about safety. It was about control." The gavel struck once. Curtis Vale didn't flinch. But Rylan Merrin watched him with the steady, unreadable gaze of someone who had already done his grieving in private. The tribunal panel, 5 men in sharp suits and quiet authority, looked down from the elevated bench like surgeons preparing a final incision. In the matter of Crestloom Flight 818, the tribunal finds in favor of Dr. Rylan Merrin. The words rang through the chamber like the echo of a pressure valve releasing. Not loud, not triumphant, but final. Rylan didn't move. He didn't blink. But deep within his chest, his lungs loosened like armor plates unlocking. The bruises on his side still ached when he inhaled. His bandages were hidden beneath a black suit, crisp but sober. Vale, seated beside him, nodded once and opened the tablet in his lap, already preparing the press brief. Curtis stood alone at the defendant's table, a tight line of sweat at his temple. The panel read out the verdict in full. 8 years under federal misconduct charges for in-flight assault, evidence tampering, and obstruction of a protected tech transfer. The courtroom murmured. Behind Curtis, his attorneys leaned in, whispering options, but he didn't respond. His jaw remained clenched, his gaze forward, not at the judges, not at the press cameras, but at Rylan, as if daring him to call it over. But it wasn't over, not even close. The moment the verdict was sealed, a chain reaction ignited. By the time Rylan exited the courthouse steps, flanked by Bram and Agent Jorenkel, media outlets were already flashing the headlines. Cresslum executive assaults EO mid-flight, loses case. Flight 818 verdict sends shockwaves through aviation industry. Investors didn't wait for explanations. Cresslum's stock dropped 5% by noon, then 12, then 23. Within 48 hours, their next 3 commercial launches were placed under regulatory review. Behind the curtain of compliance, board members scrambled. Whispers turned to statements. Executives resigned. And then the leak hit. Orange Ace, a systems analyst buried deep within Cresslum's logistics division, released internal files to Bram's encrypted channel. Files that revealed something far more calculated than a rogue employee with a grudge. One file contained an internal slide titled Manipulability Tier Index, Executive Profiles. A spreadsheet. Cold. Stock. Names, photos, and color tags. Tier 1. High influence, high risk. Tier 2. Moderate influence, cooperative potential. Tier 3. Low risk, disruption prone, minimal fallout. Most of the Tier 3s were black executives. Rylan stared at the file for a long time, without speaking. Then he forwarded it directly to the tribunal archive. No commentori. Just truth. When the press conference was called 3 days later, Soren Dynamics prepared for something routine, an update, perhaps, on the company's upcoming K-9 Sentinel deployment. But when Rylan stepped to the podium, he didn't read from a teleprompter. He held a simple manila folder. "I've delayed my team's next projects," he said plainly, his voice calm, steady. "Not because we failed, but because the system that carries our work forward has failed. And unless we build a stronger one, more people will be erased without ever being hit." He opened the folder and raised a printout of the tier index. This is what erasure looks like. Clean fonts, internal jargon, institutional strategy, but no accountability. The reporters were silent. Not a single flashbulb went off. Just a low hum of room fans and the soft shift of chairs. "I'm announcing the Meridian Integrity Standard," Rylan continued. "A new federal-aligned protocol to encrypt and detect interference with tech assets in flight or transit. It won't be optional, and it won't be silent. Every move will be logged, flagged, and reported to an independent oversight body." He paused, then gestured to Bram and Joran beside him. "They've agreed to join the advisory board. And our first action is open auditing for all federal-aligned transport carriers by year's end." A hand shot up from the press box. "Dr. Merrin, do you feel vindicated after today's ruling?" Rylan looked toward the back of the room, his eyes distant for a beat too long. Then he replied softly, "I don't feel vindicated. I feel sharpened." He stepped down from the podium. That night, Rylan sat alone in his office at Soren's headquarters, overlooking the city from a tall glass panel. His head still throbbed faintly when the light hit just right. On his desk was the capsule, still encrypted, still undamaged. It was never about the capsule. It was about what it represented, about who they thought could be quietly removed. His phone buzzed. Hundreds of messages, emails, thousands, some from CEOs, some from engineers, some from students, some from janitors. "You made it public. You didn't settle. You reminded me I matter." He turned off the screen. Bram entered the room quietly. "Tomorrow's Senate call is confirmed. You'll have 5 minutes to open." Rylan nodded. "5's enough." Bram hesitated, then added, "They're going to ask if this was personal." Rylan exhaled, slow and measured. "It was never just personal." A long silence followed. Then, Rylan stood. He walked to the window, looked out, not at the skyline, but beyond it, into the black. He spoke without turning. "This wasn't just about me," he said. "This was about how easy it is to erase someone when you think no one's watching. Now we're watching." The click of the cabin door echoed through the grounded aircraft like a memory trying to resurrect itself. Dr. Rylan Merrin stepped into the cold silence of Flight 818's fuselage, escorted by two federal inspectors clad in gray windbreakers with no visible insignia. The once bustling aircraft, now hollow and silent, creaked faintly with each footstep. First class was untouched, preserved for evidence review. And yet the air felt thick with something older than bureaucracy, betrayal. Rylan didn't hesitate. He moved directly to seat 1A and stopped. His eyes landed on the spot where it had happened, the very edge of the headrest where the emergency fire canister had struck his skull. The seat had been reupholstered, but the faint outline of darker stitching betrayed where blood had once soaked through. He lowered himself slowly, not with hesitation, but with precision. The silence inside the cabin deepened, as if the plane itself were holding its breath. He sat back, closed his eyes, let the scene replay, not in fear, but in forensic detail. The sound of the canister's swing, the flash of heat along his scalp, the split second of disorientation. He reopened his eyes and glanced toward the cockpit, then to the overhead bins. So much of the aircraft relied on assumptions, that the crew would protect, that the equipment would remain uncorrupted, that a man in uniform meant safety. That was the flaw. Design flaw, he muttered. Vale stood by the galley divider, arms crossed, his face unreadable. Agent Joran Kell leaned against a bulkhead, observing quietly, respectfully. Neither interrupted. "Not in the seat," Rylan added, standing now and placing a hand lightly on the bulkhead. "In the truss system." He reached into his coat and retrieved a small matte gray case, rectangular and sleek. With a soft click, it opened to reveal a thin wearable band lined with sensor nodes and a central capsule glowing faintly blue. He held it up. "This," Rylan said clearly, turning to face them, "detects any sudden spike in vitals, heartbeat, cortisol, pupil contraction. If you're poisoned, assaulted, drugged, this registers it and sends a signal within 3 seconds to command." Joran's brow rose. Bram stepped forward slowly. "You built this since the attack?" Bram asked. Rylan nodded. "I designed it years ago for pilot biometrics under G-load stress. Never deployed it in passenger systems because we didn't think we needed it." His voice hardened. "Turns out we do." He stepped down the aisle, brushing a hand over several headrests until he returned to 1A. He placed the band on the seat cushion gently, like setting a keystone into place. "This gets installed on every key seat," he said, starting with 1A. Bram exhaled, a quiet grin curling beneath his lip. "You're building a ghost detector." Rylan looked at him, eyes clear and resolved. "Because some threats were uniforms, not masks," he said softly. "And I'm done letting them hide." No one spoke after that, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the silence said everything. The inspectors behind them took notes, but did not interrupt the moment. Outside the aircraft, a light drizzle began to patter softly against the window panes, catching the faded reflection of the seat where it all began. Curtis Vale's assault had left bruises, yes, but also blueprints. This wasn't just a cabin walkthrough. It was a declaration. A system had failed, and now something better was being built, layered not just in tech but in resolve. Rylan turned once more toward the cockpit, then back to the seat, then slowly made his way to the exit ramp without another word. Behind him, the pulse band remained, waiting to be activated, waiting to listen, waiting to protect. The room fell silent again, but this time not from fear, from respect, from resolve, from readiness. Pain taught me to build stronger systems. The chamber was silent as the recording ended. A single frame, Rylan Merrin slumped against the aircraft window, blood trailing from his temple, held frozen on the screen. The Senate Ethics Council had seen enough. Cameras clicked faintly from the gallery above, reporters pressing their faces behind reinforced glass, waiting to broadcast judgment. Rylan remained standing, unmoving. His bandage, thin and neatly wrapped across the left side of his forehead, contrasted with the sharp lines of his tailored navy suit. But it wasn't the cloth that commanded the room, it was his voice. "If the man who hit me with a fire canister had succeeded," Rylan said, each word precise, deliberate, "you'd be looking at a headline, not a system failure." His hands rested flat on the table before him, fingers barely curled. Behind him, Vale sat rigid, eyes locked on the senator seated in a half-moon arc. Agent Jornkel, expression unreadable, stood in the shadow, near the double doors, arms folded. The projection screen dimmed, but the impact of the footage lingered like smoke after fire. "I'm here because I refuse to go quietly," Rylan continued. "So let's not pretend this was an accident." Senator Dravis, a stern-faced man in his 60s, cleared his throat and tapped a button on the panel before him. "Dr. Merrin," he said, voice firm but tinged with respect, "the council acknowledges your statement. It also acknowledges that you should not have needed to make one." No one applauded. That wasn't the kind of room this was. Down the corridor, a staffer rushed to deliver a folder to the subcommittee chair. Inside were the last of the declassified memos, evidence that Crestloom's internal branch, now exposed as Section Echelon, had authorized non-lethal disruption protocols aimed specifically at executives transporting federally significant technology. The language was coded antiseptic. Words like route stressors, containment flow, and Tier 3 variable filtration masked something far simpler: sabotage. What made it worse, what made it undeniable, was the data showing that those listed under Tier 3 were overwhelmingly black. The council read in tense silence as Bram provided context, quoting a leaked message from a now-vanished administrator named Orangeace. "The goal is not elimination, but discreditation. Delay the mission. Shake the reputation. Redirect the funding." As the weight of that sentence settled, Rylan leaned back slightly. He could feel the air shift, less hostile now, more uncertain. They hadn't expected the story to land with this force. They hadn't expected a man who bled in Seat 1A to sit here with such composure. After the hearing recessed for deliberation, Rylan stepped outside to a waiting hall lined with federal staffers and press handlers. Bram followed close behind. "You did it," Bram said under his breath. "No," Rylan replied quietly, watching a page carry papers into the elevator. "We're only halfway there." 2 hours later, the verdict was unanimous. Curtis Vale would serve 8 years under federal misconduct charges. Crestloom was to undergo regulatory seizure of all internal security systems and submit to a 2-year external audit. But the real blow came from the market. Within 48 hours, Crestloom's stock plummeted. 3 board members resigned after another leak. This one a dossier naming executives who had approved the covert disruption strategy. A justification? Operational precaution against data manipulation in high-risk demographics. One headline read, "Innovation delayed by design." Rylan didn't answer the reporters who crowded the courthouse steps. He walked past them, down into the black car waiting beneath the awning. Inside, Bram opened a secure channel on his slate. "Soren Board just pinged," he said. "They're pushing for public reassurance." Rylan said nothing. He stared out the window, buildings passing in blurred glass reflections. He had already made his decision. At the emergency board press conference the next morning, Rylan stepped to the podium without notes. Behind him, the Soren Dynamics logo glowed against a pale blue backdrop. "This company will delay all non-essential projects," he said, eyes scanning the assembled journalists and analysts. "Not to recover, but to rewire." Murmurs rippled through the room. "We're launching the Meridian Integrity Standard. It will encrypt and track every interaction with federal-aligned tech, from transport to handoff, while flagging any attempt at manipulation in real time." One reporter raised his hand. "Dr. Merrin, some say you're using this moment to retaliate." "I'm using this moment to protect," Rylan replied, voice steady. "Because if this happened to me, it can happen to someone else, someone who won't wake up." Bram stepped forward, officially joining the advisory panel alongside Agent Joran. The announcement triggered cautious praise from regulators, cautious outrage from competitors. But none of it fazed Rylan. That evening, he walked the hangar floor alone, past engineers who silently nodded as he passed. They weren't just employees anymore, they were witnesses. Back in his office, he watched one final message play, a video sent from a university lab. A student in a hoodie spoke into the camera, eyes wide with fire. "Thank you," the student said, "for not letting them erase you, for not settling, for making space for the rest of us." Rylan's fingers hovered above the playback controls. He let the message loop. Then he stood and turned out the lights. Flight 818 changed everything, but not the way they planned. The rotors of the prototype aircraft hummed with precision, casting flickers of cobalt blue light across the polished tarmac. Dr. Rylan Merrin stood just beyond the aircraft's wingtip, the wind tugging gently at the hem of his dark coat. He held the biometric capsule in both hands, now reset, inactive, and enclosed in a transparent archival case, less a device now than a symbol. The quiet buzz of camera shutters and murmurs from a crowd of reporters built behind the security barrier. But Rylan's focus never left the aircraft. It was the first of its kind to fly with the K9 Sentinel system fully integrated, fully protected. A boy's voice pierced the background. "Are you the man who fought back?" Rylan looked down to see a young boy, 13, maybe younger, standing just beside the press line. The boy wore a navy blazer that hung slightly too big on his shoulders, eyes wide with a blend of admiration and awe. His presence wasn't expected, but neither was the question. "I'm the man who survived," Rylan replied softly. His voice carried weight, measured, not mournful, but built on the memory of pain, and then made sure no one else would have to fight like that again. The boy stared at the capsule. "That's the thing they tried to steal." Rylan knelt, holding the case forward just enough for the boy to see the biometric seal that still bore faint scratches, the remnants of failed tamper attempts. They wanted what was inside, but they didn't understand what it meant. Before the boy could ask another question, footsteps approached from behind. Vale arrived first, crisp in a federal blue suit, tablet in hand, scanning updates. Agent Joran Kell followed close behind, arms folded, scanning the perimeter with practiced caution. "They're requesting you speak to the press," Bram said, voice low. "We can hold them another few minutes if you'd rather keep this moment." "I'm done speaking to people who already made up their minds," Rylan murmured. His eyes never left the aircraft. "But I'll speak through the system. That's what matters." Bram nodded with quiet respect. "Documentary's out. They're already showing it to every new aviation officer entering the Corps. Flight 818 is no longer a route number. It's a warning label." Rylan didn't smile, but his fingers tightened ever so slightly around the capsule. Behind him, the aircraft systems ran quiet diagnostics. Every pulse, every signature, every micro-adjustment now reported back to the Sentinel core, an architecture Rylan had spent the last 4 weeks refining. But this wasn't just about technology. This was architecture born of trauma, blueprint from blood and betrayal, and now made real. "Security grid test in 60, Joran said, checking his watch. "Do you want to be inside during ignition?" "No," Rylan replied. "I want to see it from out here. I want to feel what they tried to bury." He took a slow breath, one that felt heavier than air. "And I want to make sure it doesn't die with me." The boy's father called from the press area, waving him back. The child hesitated. Rylan handed him something, a micro-brochure detailing the K9 Sentinel project, wrapped in a navy blue holder marked with the Vale Corps crest. "Read it. Someday you'll build better." The boy's face lit up as he turned and ran back. And as he did, Rylan watched him go, not just as a father might, but as a designer of systems that would protect boys like him for years to come. The whine of engines spooling up interrupted the silence. Lights on the fuselage brightened, casting long shadows across the tarmac. Bram and Joran flanked Rylan as the wind picked up again. The team that tried to erase him was gone. But their methods? Still lingering in shadows, still waiting for silence to return. "Not this time." "Is it strange," Bram said quietly, "that this all started over a seat?" Rylan didn't look away from the aircraft. "Not strange. That's where they always start. somewhere small. But if you don't stand up then, they think you'll never stand up at all. The Sentinel's final diagnostics lit green across Bram's tablet. The launch was go. Rylan stepped forward to the line drawn in paint across the tarmac, a symbolic boundary between past and future. He raised the capsule, now inert, and let the sun hit its surface. The scar on the casing glinted like a warning flare. For a moment, everything held still. The rotors lifted. The crowd behind the gates quieted. And in that breathless pause before the aircraft rose into the air, Rylan whispered, not to Bram, not to Joran, not to anyone, but to the memory of the cabin he left bloodied. Now we fly different. Moments later, the CEO moved with precision, locking the attacker in a chokehold that froze the crew in place. The cabin erupted, the airline panicked, and the attendant's arrogance shattered under the weight of his own violence. If you believe real authority rises even after being knocked down, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, abuse of authority, and the consequences that follow when arrogance meets accountability. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, respect, and standing up against injustice.